We're now on Daf Daled Amud Aleph, and we're up to Omar Rav Sheshes. Let's see if we can find the place. It's about 4 lines down from the top. And the Gemara has quoted a Smichus HaParshios in order to establish the halacha of Esei Dochalosa, because in Parshas Ki Tetzei it opens with Lo Silbat Shatnes, and then it continues in the very next pasuk, Gedilim Taselecha. And that mitzvah of Gedilim Taselecha, which ends with Arba Kanfos Ksuspa Asher Tchaseba, is teaching me a limitation rule in regard to the previous pasuk, the lav of Lo Silba Shatnes, to say that for the sake of the mitzvah of Gedilim Taselecha, of wearing chutei tzitzis, and let's say these chutim are made of wool, and the garment itself is made of linen, you will go ahead and you will wear that beged with a shatnez situation. You will have a combination of wool and linen in the same garment, and even though that would constitute a violation of lo silba shatnez, but the Torah is telling you that for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis, we will be doche the lo silba shatnez. And the Ramban here, which you'll see quoted in the footnote, if you happen to have the footnote here, we'll see it later in its longer form in the pages that I gave out. The Ramban says, "Ein lahakshus alima mitzitzis shesei dochalosa b'kol haTorah mal tzitzis shekain shkula keneged kol hamitzvos." Perhaps just like we had a hierarchy of lotases, and we were not willing to apply Esei Dochalota set to a Losa Sechamor, like, for example, a Chiv Kares. So, too, on the flip side, maybe there's a special halach of Esei Dochalota and an Esei Chamor, and tzitzis would fit that bill because it's Shkula Keneged Kol HaMitzvahs. Says the Ramban, Ein din dechias halav toli b'schar. When we say that tzitzis is Shkula Keneged Kol HaMitzvahs, that means you'll get a great deal of reward for it. But that doesn't mean that it has a superior position with regard to the principle of Esei Dochalosas. So Mirz Hashem, we're going to come back to this Ramban a little bit later, and we'll see what he develops based on a Gemara later on at Vav. Omar Rav Sheshes, Omar Rav Elazar, Mishum Rav Elazar ben Azariah. Minayin liyavama shenafla lifnei mukashchin. She'ein chosmin osa. How do we know that in the case where a Yevama falls to Yibum in front of course, her late husband's brother, and he is a mukashchin, and she says she doesn't want to marry a mukashchin, she's demanding chalitza to free her from this zikas Yibum. How do we know that ein chosminosa, which literally means we don't muzzle her mouth? It means we're not sosem her tainus, and we allow her to put forth this claim, and we listen and we accept this claim, and instead of forcing her into the yibum situation, we're going to force him to deliver chalitza. How do we know such a thing? And the reason why this Gemara is here in the context of Esei Dochalosaseh is because the Gemara wants to know whether or not we can derive from Smichus HaParshios conclusions, not only about Esei Dochalosaseh, but general conclusions about mitzvahs. And in this case, the mitzvah of Yibum. Shenemar. Now let's take a look at 2 psukim in Parshas Ki Tetzei that are contiguous, that are smuchim, one before the other. The first pasuk says, "Lo sachsam shar b'disho," and we're not allowed to muzzle a shar as we work with the shar in the fields. The samach lein, immediately in the next pasuk it says, "Ki yeshvu achim yachdav." I'll read the entire pasuk. Umeis echad mehem uvein elo yivama yavo eleha ulekachalo liyishav yivma. And why is the Torah placing the mitzvah of Yibum immediately contiguous to the Isur Lav of Lo Sachsim Shar B'Disho, to teach me that even though as a general rule, the Yavam will be miyabim this woman, whether she likes it or not. That's his absolute obligation. But nevertheless, ein chosmin es pi isha. She's no worse than an animal, right? An animal, you're not allowed to muzzle its mouth. You can't muzzle the mouth of the Yavama. And in the case of an objective claim that she has, she doesn't want to be mitziyabim to a mukat shchin, then ein kofanosa. We're going to listen to her claim. We're not going to muzzle her. And we're going to therefore force the Yavam, if he refuses to do so, to give chalitza and to free her from this marriage and from this zika. So we have now two droshos which are based on smichas aparshios. We have kelayim b'tzitzis, from which we derive in the first case, the first parsha that we saw, that there's no Easer of Shatnis in the case of Tzitzis. So the second parsha of Tzitzis is limiting the previous parsha and telling me that under certain circumstances, when there's a mitzvah of Tzitzis, the previous parsha, the Easer lav of Shatnis doesn't apply, and you'll wear a beged of Shatnis for the sake of the mitzvah of Tzitzis. But in the case of Chasima, we're really doing the opposite. Why? Because our goal is to suspend the mitzvah of Yibum. And the first parsha tells me that we're not allowed to be choseh, and that applies only in a case of the second parsha. Okay, then? So that, again, in the case of tzitzis, the structure of smuchim is to undermine the losasa that came before the essay and to establish that there's no lav of shatnez. In the case of chasima, the lotax of shar b'disho, the second pasuk is coming in a sense to undermine the first pasuk and contradict it and saying that with regard to yibum, we have a limitation in the mitzvah of yibum, meaning the second pasuk would indicate that yibum applies straight across the board, even in a case where he's a mukashkin. The first pasuk is now coming to limit the second pasuk and tell me that lo saksam shar b'dicho, and therefore yibum will not apply, and we cannot compel her liz yabim, so that the directions here of these two smuchin are the reverse. In the first case, the second pasuk is limiting the first pasuk, and in the second smuchin, it's just the opposite. The first pasuk is limiting the second pasuk. The Saksam is telling me that in this circumstance there is no yibum, and the second pasuk, the mitzvah yibum, does not apply. Now, Tosus, Dibra Maskal Dichsiv, this long Tosus here on the left is bothered by this. He doesn't appreciate that we can use the first parsha, the first pasuk, shall we say, in the parsha, to limit the second parsha. Minayin lanu lidrosh b'yofen. Who told you that you're allowed to darshan in that? In other words, in Kelayim B'tzitzis, the second mitzvah, the second pasuk, the mitzvah tzitzis, is coming to limit the previous pasuk. Now, Tosus says, let's be consistent about it. If you're taking the second drasha of Yibum and you're applying the principle that smichus in the first pasuk will limit the application of the second pasuk, so that Lo Saksam tells me that the mitzvah of Yibum does not apply in that case of Chasima, then why not be consistent about it and tell me that the lav of Lo Silba Shatnes is coming to limit the mitzvah of Tzitzis, and teach me that the mitzvah of Tzitzis which follows will not apply in a case, in a circumstance of a scenario of Shatnes. And that would be reflected in the structure, the nature of the drasha in the case of Lo Saksam, where the Lo Saksam tells that the mitzvah even does not apply in a case of Lo Saksam. And therefore the Lo silva shatnez, you tell me that the mitzvah of tzitzis does not apply in the case of shatnez. That's Tosfos's kash. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a summary of Tosfos's answer, and maybe when we have a little bit more time, because I still want to get to Rabbi Chanan from yesterday, we can go line by line, through this Tosfos the Siv, but just, I don't want to keep you in this cliffhanger. I want to try to understand how Tosfos is going to wiggle out of this problem, because there seems to be two contradictory methods of applying the principle of smuchim. He says the following: B'chol makom ba smichus lahotzi midei svara pshuta. In other words, we have what we call a havamina and a maskana. When the Torah goes out of its way to attach two different parshios or two different psukim and make them contiguous, the Torah is giving you a maskana, a conclusion, which is coming lafuke lahotzi midei havamina. I'm going to be machadich to you a chiddush, says the Torah, and I'm going to use and employ the principle of smichus to change your impression. What is the impression before smichus? Whatever that impression is, I call it a havamina. In that light, in that context, we can appreciate the smichus, the maskana. So, in other words, smichus is lahotzi midei svar pshuta. What is the svar pshuta? It says the following: in the case of kilayim b'tzitzis, the svar pshuta would be that the iser shatnez would limit the mitzvah of tzitzis. Why? Because shatnez tells you what kind of begadim you're allowed to wear, what kind of begadim you're not allowed to wear. And once you get into the situation where you have a beggar that you're allowed to wear, then you're obligated to the mitzvah of tzitzis. But why would I entertain, if not for the smichus, the havamina that you could take a beggar, which the Torah is just defined as shatnez, that you're not allowed to wear it, and then be mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis? You're not allowed to wear that beggar. In the case of yibum, the havamina would be that just like in every other circumstance and any other situation of yibum, the Torah wants the yibum to take place. Let's call it, l'kayim zerali achiv, and it should apply even if this guy is never mukashchin, so that the smichus will always come lafuke svara pshuta. So in Kalayim b'tzitzis, the Torah is coming to limit the parsha rishona and telling me that here, for the sake of the mitzvah tzitzis, we will not impose the iser shatnez. And the second parsha of tzitzis is telling me what I wouldn't have even entertained if not for smichus, namely to wear a beged and put tzitzis on when you're not allowed to be wearing that beged. That doesn't make a bit of sense. And the Torah, therefore, through smichus aparshis, is coming lafuke to be motzi midei svar pshuta. And therefore, we need smuchim, because again, if the smichus is coming to tell me that because you're not allowed to wear this beged, therefore there's no mitzvah tzitzis, that's pshita. I don't need the smichus for that. I would know that mismar. Now we get to the case of chasima in Yevamos, in Yevamot. Here the Torah is telling me that the first parsha of Lo Sachsom will apply even if there's a second parsha of Yibum. And we're not allowed to be chosev, in this context, the mouth of the Yevama, to shove Yibum down her throat, because Svar Pshuta would be that who gives us the right to force and compel the Yavam to give chalitza if he's interested in Yibum? He wants to mekayim his mitzvah of Yibum and be mekayim zerali achiv, shenli achiv. Why would she have a right to block him and force him to give a chalitza? That's not a Svar Pshuta. The Svar Pshuta is on the contrary. The Torah gave him the mitzvah of Yimum, and now he has the right to claim, I want to get access, give me my opportunity to become the mitzvah of Yimum, lahakim shem, le'achiv ames. But Mashmalan, the Smichas HaParshias is coming lafuke, and to give us a maskana that is, in a sense, radical. It's not something that's intuitive, to tell me that no, she has the right in this case to demand chalitz, and we will force him to demand to give chalitz. Now, before we go on with the parsha of Smichas HaParshios, I would like to learn the Rebbe Chanan that we got stuck on yesterday and see if we can make a little bit more progress today. So we're on page Chaf over here. Mitch, you have it, right? Page Chaf? If not, I have it somewhere. Where do I have it here? 1 second. Give me a second. I'm always looking for pages here. Yeah, no. I want to give Rich his own private copy. He can make notes in it, and I think I got it. Please double check that. Yeah. Let's see. Is there another way? If we do it this way, then you see my back. All right. So let's just see. Maybe if we do it. Let's see. If we did it this way, then I would have to stand here. If let's say if I what? Oh, then they won't see me. And if let's say if there's any way you gentlemen could sit, there wouldn't be any place for you to sit. That would. Oh, I guess because the camera's here, then I guess I don't know.
Why do you want to change it?
What?
Why do you want to change it?
No, I would like to be looking at everybody at the same time. There should be a way of doing that. Okay. Whatever. We'll figure this out. There's got to be, I'm just very bad at these kinds of engineering, but there's got to be a way that I can look at everybody at the same time, because I feel kind of uncomfortable. I'm looking at you gentlemen, and then, okay. So now we say the following. Motzinu b'kalayim b'tzitzis. You have the place on page Chaf, and it's about 7 lines down from the top. Af b'kalayim b'tzitzis. Af shehem mekar ledin esei dochalosas b'kol Torah. The Gemara seems to assume, and we don't find any rejection of this principle, that esei dochalosas. If I quiz you and I ask you where's the source for esei dochalosas the Torah, you will quote me the parsha of Kilayim B'tzitzis with the Smichas HaParshios. V'im kol zeh eina dechia ba'alma ela heter gomerhu. This is a very paradoxical situation, because we always assume that esei dochalosas is a law of dechia. The Torah tells me that you can violate this isur, whatever the law is, for the sake of the mitzvah. That's called dechia. And if we assume that esei dochalosa is halacha of mechanics of dechia, then obviously the source, the paradigmic case of esei dochalosa, would have to fit that description, would have to be dechia. And there's something very paradoxical, because Rabbi Chanan is claiming, and we'll see how he proves it from Rabbeinu Tam, that in the case of Kilayim B'tzitzis, we're not talking about esei dochalosas. We're not allowing you to wear shatnez, but rather we're saying that this is not called shatnez. This is not included in the hekef, in the scope, and the application of the isur of shatnez. And I'll prove it to you from Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam has a revolution of sorts, and he allows shatnez even in the absence of a kiyum mitzvah. And we'll have 2 examples of that. We'll have tzitzis b'layla, and we're going according to that man yoma that says that Laila loves man tzitzis, and we derive from a recent also. And what about the case of an Isha? An Isha is not obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzis, because again, we're holding now Laila loves man tzitzis, which makes tzitzis into a mitzvah seishas man groma, noshim pturos. And what happens if a person wants to wear shatnez with tzitzis of wool on a beged of pishton at night, or a woman wants to wear shatnez and she's not obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzis. She has a voluntary mitzvah of tzitzis that she takes upon herself. And now we're going to apply the principle of what? Esei dochalos. This can't be Esei dochalos. It cannot qualify as Esei dochalos, says Rabbi Chanan, because there is no Esei. Came Lashitas Rabbeinu Tam, mutarim heim. You're allowed to put this tcheles of tzemer on a beged of linen of pishton, af kishe'ena miskayeves mitzvahs tzitzis kigon laila o noshin. This is like a very, very sticky issue over here. You're telling me that Esei dochalosa said. Now you're telling me, no, this is not Esei dochalosa said. Your very paradigmic case from which you derive Esei dochalosa said, paradoxically, is a case of heter gomu. It's got to be heter gomu. It can't be Esei dochalosa said, because there is no Esei. I can feel the pain of Rabbi Chanan. I just don't know how he solves the problem. Ubir bazer, the afshe heteru. Okay, that's undeniable. There's no mitzvah saseya. You're gonna have to say it's a heter. Eino begeder dover shehutar michlol shalosh shayches bo sibas ha'is. He says you can't tell me that this is hutar michlol. Right? Let's spend a minute. I think Rebbe Chanan here is exercising literary license. He's borrowing a term from a different context just to, for pedagogic and dramatic reasons. He's talking about hutar michlol. What's hutar michlol? Hutar michlol is a case where you have an isur, and the isur initially at stage number one applies, as we say in Yiddish, umatum, in other words, here, there, and elsewhere, straight across the board. And then at some later stage, the Torah makes a swap, a switch, you turn a corner, and now its application, the application of this Isur is very, very limited. So, for example, there's an Isur Chadash, which initially has a very broad scope. It applies both to Achilas Adam and Achilas Mizbeach. But then after we bring the Omer on the 16th of Nisan, now it becomes Hutar Michlol. We take a chunk of that Isur of Chadash and we remove it. But Hutar Michlol, says Rabbi Chanan, means that there's a total heter. We completely remove the Isur. There is no Isur Chadash le Achilas Hejot after the Omer. Rabbi Chanan, that's not what's happening here in Shatnez, according to Rabbeinu Tam, Laila and Noshim. Eino begeder, quote, Davar shehuta michlolo, which means a davar de lo shayches bo sibas ha'isur. The sibas ha'isur is completely removed because we already brought the Omer. Once we brought the Omer, then vis-a-vis achilas hejot, we have Yashar. Elavadai, here in the case of Shatnez, which you're wearing at night, yesh bahem sibas isur. Wow. Yesh bahem sibas isur. I mean, you have to really be an abstract thinker to translate, to understand these words. Vadai sheyesh bahem sibas isur. What does that mean, Ribono Shel Olam? Either it's us or it's mutter. What do you mean? Yesh bahem sibas isur. You're telling me that it's mutter. I'm allowed to, at night I can wear the tzitzis. I come home at night and I have to strip myself of this beged because there's no essay at night. And I was wearing shatnez during the day, but the Torah said I'm allowed to wear shatnez during the day. Now the sun sets, I got to take off the shatnez. No, says Rabbeinu Tam, continue to wear the shatnez. But you should know that you're allowed to wear the shatnez, but the sibas ha-isur yesh bahem. What does that mean? Sibas ha-isur. What's hey sibas ha-isur? It needs to be. Sibas ha-isur. It sounds like Aristotelian physics. What do you mean sibas ha-isur? Either it's us or it's mutter. Like give it a break. No, it's mutter, but yesh bahem sibas ha-isur. Some sort of an abstract idea here. Normally I would take this and just, you know what I mean? This is not for me. It's a Berzon. This is not for Berzon. But Rebbe Chanan, you know what I mean? Elavadai sheyesh ben sibas ha'isa. Where's that new pencil you bought? I got a little. Now we have it. Office Depot. Baldi. The one you got me, is it? Okay. This doesn't have a point. I don't know. This one at least has a point until I press too hard and then the point goes on me. So let's underline these words. Vada yesh bahem sibas isur. Like mitzvahs hatzitis. What do you mean mitzvahs hatzitis? We're talking about Lila. We're talking about an Isha. What do you mean mitzvahs hatzitis? Mitzvahs hatzitis shebechefza shel habeged. Matira sa'isa. Meaning during the day, when I had mitzvahs hatzitis, it's mati. At night, I don't have mitzvahs hatzitis, but I still have the heter in the chefza the beged. I mean, basically, Rebbe Chanan, I think, is revolutionizing our understanding of the mitzvah of tzitzis. He's saying that the mitzvah of tzitzis doesn't begin with the gavra like every other mitzvah. You tell me, take a lulav, right? Which lulav will I take? Give me a good price on a good lulav, I'll buy it from you. But there's nothing inherent in this lulav that could claim ownership, so to speak, on the mitzvah. But not so in the case of tzitzis. The tzitzis is a mitzvah that evolves. And it evolves from the beged itself. He calls it the chefz of the beged. The chefz of the beged is a four-cornered garment. Am I wearing it? Not yet. I didn't even put it on yet. Right now, I'm using it as a tablecloth. Subsequently, in stage 2, when I put the beged on my body, which is called levisha, at that point, the chefz of the beged now generates a chovas gavra, such that I have to put tzitzis on the beged. I mean, that's not the same as lulav. It's not that, there's an inherent chiyuv in the lulav. The lulav cries out, take me. And then when I take the lulav, that chovas chefza of the lulav now generates a chovas gavra. No. There's no such thing as a 2-stage process in the mitzvah of lulav or any other mitzvah. Only in tzitzis. So that in lulav, there's only one question. Am I obligated or am I not obligated? Forget about the lulav. If you're obligated, go find yourself a lulav. You can't find money, sell the shirt off your back. I don't care. You borrow, beg, or steal, you'll buy a lulav and you'll shake the lulav. But in tzitzis, It all depends on the beged. And once the beged has the dimensions of a chiyuv tzitzis, there is a chiyuv tzitzis in the beged. He calls it mitzvah tzitzis shebachefza shal beged. My nafkamina. Well, what's the significance? If I could talk to my beged, you remember maybe you're dating yourself. Do you remember that horse? I think it was called Mr. Ed. Yeah? Oh, you're shaking your heads. That's good. Anybody else remember Mr. Ed? The talking horse. I mean, it's biblical, really. I mean, in the Bible, I guess it was a mule, but horse, mule. We get back to, Fiddler on the Roof. But be that as it may, we now have a talking beged, according to Rabbi Chana. The beged is a talking beged. And the beged is telling me that there's no Iser Shatnis in the beged. What does that mean? What are you talking about? This beged Shatnis. If I put it on, I'm violating the law of Shatnis. So Rabbi Chanan says that the Torah is matir wearing the beged because the beged itself is crying out, I am a four-cornered beged, and I want you to wear me and be Mekayim with me, the Levisha, the mitzvah of tzitzis. It's an unbelievable abstract. I mean, it's like we're climbing up to the worlds of philosophy over here. So again, that same beged that is crying out for the mitzvah of tzitzis is also crying out that I am shatnez. You just tied tzitzis of tzemer on a beged shel pishtan. You can't wear me. So yesh b'hem siva sa'isa. When I look at this beged and I ask, are the seeds sown in the beged? Is the beged inherently a chefza of Iser vis-a-vis levisha shatnez? The answer is yes. But the Torah is matir that Iser. Why? Because of the mitzvah tzitzis shebachefza. What do you mean mitzvah tzitzis shebachefza? There's no mitzvah tzitzis in the chefza. My tzitzis don't talk to me. I mean, if they do, then you have to lock me up. And not only that, if I put this beged with his tzitzis on a table and cover the table as a tablecloth, so there's no Easter involved over here, and there's no mitzvah involved. Now, Rabbi Chanan claims that this is the key to unlock the mystery of Rabbeinu Tam. How could Rabbeinu Tam allow you to wear this beged of shatnez at night, or a woman day or night? And the answer is because in the chefetz itself, inherently, there's a mitzvah of tzitzis. And that mitzvah of tzitzis is going to be matir the chefetz of shatnez, such that when I wear this, so again, if I'm wearing it during the day or a male as opposed to a female, I understand. The Torah is matir the levish of shatnez because of the essay of tzitzis. But Rabbeinu Tam is going a major step further. He's taking a leap of faith and he's saying that even at night, even an Isha could wear these tzitzis in a beged shel shatnez. The af, this is the key of keys, shelo bizman kiyum mitzvah. That status of mitzvah tzitzis shebachefta has the power to be matir the Iser of Levishas Shatnez, but here's the punchline, even absent a kiyum mitzvah. So the Gavra gets no credit for this at night. And yet, there's no violation of an Iser. Why? Because the process is a two-stage process, and the mitzvah of tzitzis evolves. In order to be matir the Iser Shatnez, all I need is stage one, and I don't need the culmination of stage two. I need that first stage that tells me that this beged, although it's a chefetz of shatnez, is also a chefetz of mitzvah tzitzis. And inherent in the beged, I have already the beginning of the process of dechia, and now I just have to wear the tzitzis. Whether or not I'm a kayim the mitzvah, irrelevant. Umikol makom yesh lilmod mimena. Lechol esei docha lo saseh, In other words, what generates the heter of wearing this beged according to Rabbeinu Tam at Laila, if not for the fact that the chefta is a chefta of mitzvah tzitzis? And again, to use this mashal, the garment itself is crying out, wear me. Because there's a mitzvah of tzitzis inherent in the chefta of the beged itself. And since the heter to allow me to wear this is in the chefta, because by virtue of the fact that under certain circumstances, this chefta lends itself to the mitzvah tzitzis, so that generates a kiyuv mitzvah in the chefta. That kiyuv mitzvah in the chefta is going to override the lav of shatnez, and therefore we can derive from this parsha the esei dochalosa principle. Be'achar she is sod hetera hu machmas ha-mitzvah. Therefore, behechrei sheyesh koach l'chol esin shevatorah lidchos isala. Now I'm going to take the leap of faith, and I'm going to say that for the sake of the mitzvah of matzah, for example, I can override the isur of chadash, where there's no two stages. But it doesn't matter. I don't need two stages. Why? Because from tzitzis I derive that I can be matir the isur based on the first stage, meaning the stage of the tzitzis in the chefta. And from there, I'm going to extrapolate that when there's a kiyuv mitzvah befall, in actuality in the gavra, that will override the locus. So this is how Rabbi Chanan, in his Weltanschauung, he's able to reconcile two things that seem to be mutually exclusive. On the one hand, you're telling me that esei dochalos is only a halach of dechia. It's not a heter. And on the other hand, you're telling me that kalayim b'tzitzis is a heter. And I'll prove it to you, says Rabbi Chanan. It's got to be a heter because of Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam is allowing you, he's being matir tzitzis b'kalayim even without a kiyum mitzvah. So it must be a din of heter. But says Rabbi Chanan, where is the yesod of the heter? Where is the sibas heter? And the sibas heter goes back to the sibas isur, and the sibas heter and the sibas isur both emanate from the same source, and that's the chefts of the beged. And this is a whole new principle of how we can be matir and isur. And the nafkamina is going to be even in the absence of the kiyum mitzvah. From that, we can extrapolate and derive the universal principle of esei dochalosa as a dechia. Now, you might ask me, well, I don't get it. Why are you limiting esei dochalosa to a law of dechia, and you're not willing to go one step further and apply heter when the source for esei dochalosa is kalayim b'tzitzis, where we've proven that it's a heter? But the answer is no. The reason why kalayim b'tzitzis is a heter is because of the chefta, the beged, as a chefta of mitzvah tzitzis. Then I can apply the principle of heter. The Torah is saying that you will not violate the isur of kilayim of shatnez when you wear something that is a chefta of mitzvah tzitzis. But when I don't have that ability to nip the isur in the bud by saying there's no chefta of shatnez here because it's a chefta of mitzvah tzitzis, and I can only apply esei dochalosa as a gavra, as a kiyum gavra, then there's a halach of dechia, and we consider it as if the lav is still very much applicable. There's no heter on it. Everybody know who this is? I think we mentioned in the past, did we not? Yes, no, maybe so. Reb Nachum, his last name was Pertzovitz, and he was a Rosh Hashiva in the Mir Yeshiva. Now, as a youngster, I was learning in the yeshiva next door to the Mir, called Beis HaTalmud. But night Seder, I used to learn in the Mir. It was just a stone throw. There are two buildings, since we're learning smichas, that were contiguous. But I didn't go to Reb Nachum Shiurim, I saw Reb Nachum. And quite a few of my older friends who are a few years older than me, learned by Reb Nachum. And he didn't publish anything. when they quote Chidushay Rabbi Nachum, they're really quoting his Talmidim. They transcribed the Shiurim and then they edited it. Now, I have a neighbor in Har Nof by the name of Rav Shmuel Kupawasser. And he and his brother both learned by Rav Nachum, and they were they spearheaded this whole campaign to publish Rav Nachum's Torah. It's quite a financial undertaking. Anyway, Madua Dafka B'Yavam Ha'esei Matir Es Ha'isur L'Gam. So for this, to appreciate Rav Nachum's question, we go back to page Yutes, or I think, is it on the flip side of your pages, or it's a different page? So you may recall, in the bottom left of page Yutes, we had a Minchas Chinuch who quoted both a Tosfos and a Ramban, and he identified the two as one and the same svar, I mean. And Tosfos was of the opinion that in the case of Yibum, we cannot derive Esei Dochalosasa because it's mitzvaso b'kach. Right? How would you be Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum without overriding the lav and the erva of Eishes Ach? And the Ramban embellishes this in his own formulation, his own language. And he says that when the Torah was matir the Isur Eishes Ach, in the case of Yibum, it's not mishum dechia, ela hutar legamri. The Torah is saying that the Isur lav and erev of Eishes Ach only apply shalom b'makom Yibum. But b'makom Yibum, that lav doesn't apply. So we curtail the lav itself. So Rav Nachum wants to try to understand why is this so simple? And we're going to say that we classify Yibum as an essay which is matir the Isur, whereas in Kol Atar Kula, an essay does not have the power to be matir the Isur. It's only a dechia. He says, "Li'olam b'chol essay yesh b'kakam lidchos v'gam latiro meikaro ela shakol l'fi tzorech ha'inyan." Says the following, that in truth, the potential for being matir the Isur in any case of a mitzvah, no matter what mitzvah it is there. But we have to see, the Torah is going to try to decide whether or not there's a pressing need to be matir the Isur. Only when we have to be matir the Isur, which we'll explain in the mitzvah Yibum in a minute, then we apply the principle of hutra. The Yavam, Mukhrach sha mitzvah tatir legamre es ervas eishes ach. Below dai b'dichui v'al shim loke lo yitfas ba kinyan ayibum sharei ein kiddushin tosin b'chayve krisus. The essence of the mitzvah of Yibum is kiddushin, is to establish a kinyan, and we've discussed this in the past. We'll see it over and over again throughout the Masechet. But it's impossible to recognize to activate, so to speak, the Isur of Eishes Ach and say, well, we're going to be docha that erva, because then you're not going to achieve this mitzvah of Yibum, which requires a kinyan ishus. There is no kinyan ishus if the relationship between he and her is that of an erva, because ein kiddushin tosin b'chayve krisus. So the erva relationship between he and her, between the Yavam and his brother's wife, is such that it makes it impossible to create a kinyan. The only possibility of achieving the goal and the mitzvah of Yibum, namely the kinyan ishus, is only if you completely neutralize the erva of Eishes Ach. It cannot be dichui, because dichui means that the Isur erva of Eishes Ach still exists. He says in the all universal cases of Esei Dochalosa, so we don't have this very unique structure, this mechanics, there's no need to be matir these, so therefore we're going to apply the din of Dechim. Very profound. I just want to add a footnote of my own here. if I understand this from Rab Nachum correctly, and again, tell me if I'm wrong here, there's another reason why we have to assume that the Torah is matir the erev of H's ach, and that is mamzerus. What do I mean? The child that's born to this Yibum has what we call yuchsin. It has to have yuchsin. If it's not miyuchas, then how would you be making shem liyachim? Now in hilchas yuchsin, if a man has a relationship with a chayve krisis, the child is not miyuchas; it's a mamzer. So that if you're going to apply the principle of dechiyah and say that the Torah is being doche the lav, but it still remains an erev of Eishes Ach. Look at the language of Nachum. He writes that muchach shah mitzvah tatil legamrei es ervas Eishes Ach. Yeah, I would tell you that he's absolutely right, but for a whole different reason. It has to be that the mitzvah is mat to the erva, because if it's not mat to the erva legamrei, then the child of such a relationship would be a mamzer. You're going to have to assume that the Torah was mat to the Yisur of Eishes Ach. Or as Tosfos and the Ramban say, each one in his own language, mitzvah sabakach, or the Yisur of Eishes Ach only applies shalom b'makom yibum, but below makom yibum there is no Yisur of Eishes Ach. So we're completely removing the status of erva here. And therefore, kedusha atosin, and you could have the kiyum mitzvah, and therefore I went on to add that there's yuchs. But let me add another footnote. We discussed yesterday, or maybe it was the day before yesterday, pikuach nefesh. And we're assuming that esei docha losa said, except in the case of Yibum, is dechiyah. So you're really violating the law, but the Torah, that's the paradox of dechiyah, the Torah allows you to violate the law. It's like bringing a carbon betuma, but there's ritzui tzitz, according to one man, the other, that's called dechuya. Really, you're violating the Isur, bring a carbon tummy on the mizbeach. We don't allow you to do so, but the Torah allows it through the ritzui of tzitz, and the ritzui of tzitz is only dechiyah. But you are bringing something on. Pikuach nefesh is not so. As we said yesterday, or the day before, whenever we said it, pikuach nefesh doesn't operate midin dechiyah. For example, I'm a mature physician, so you'll relate to this. Let's say there's a chola mesukon on Shabbos, and you're sharing a partnership with a non-Jewish physician. Are you going to tell your partner to take care of this chola because you don't want to violate the Shabbos? It says, "Afilu gadol b'Yisrael," to take care of the chola and violate the Shabbos. In fact, I don't want to get into sticky issues here in halacha, but I'm not even sure that for the sake of pikuach nefesh, you have to hire a non-Jewish taxi driver. And you have to be careful, that everything you do is a shinui, so you shouldn't violate a malacha doraisa. I don't know if any of that applies. It could be that in pikuach nefesh, there's no Isur at all. The Torah is saying that the Isur of violating the Shabbos, for example, or any other Isur, does not apply b'makom pikuach nefesh. So I'm just pointing out that even though we seem to have almost everyone on board that esei docha losas entails violating an Isur, and the Torah allows you to violate the Isur, and that's called dechiyah, that doesn't in any way straitjacket me to apply the same principle, the same mechanics to pikuach nefesh. To pikuach nefesh, it's putra. Dichsiv lo silva shatnis gedilim passiv. Afshe makar din esei tochalosim midrash now. Nasnu rishonim tam. Oh, this is what I was looking for yesterday. I couldn't find it. Lidin zeh. Now, this is very interesting. If you would have asked me in the middle of the night, tell me, wake me up and say, why is esidokalosis? So I would yell at you, but I would say, what do you mean, why is esidokalosis? The Torah says, Gevilim Tasaloko. And we have smichas aparshas. Don't hot my chinik with why does the Torah say? So this comes under what we call Taimi Dekra. Now, Taimi Dekra is very speculative, and it entails coming up with some intuitively logical, philosophical analysis. So what I want to do with you is I want to learn this piece that has 5 different approaches to explain esidokalosis. And what I want to ask you, as we go through these 5, I want you to ask yourself the question, is this called Taimi Dekra? Are we simply speculating about the philosophy that underlies esidokalosis? Why is essay overidolosis? Or is this halachic thinking? In other words, is this something that we can prove within the system of halach? We don't have to stretch our arm out to philosophy. We don't have to learn the Maral Prague or the Rambam's Mor Nevuchim. Okay. So who's first on the list? Rab Nisan Gon. Now, Rab Nisan Gon is, if I'm not mistaken, you can check me out on Google, but he is an individual that bridges or spans 2 periods in Jewish history. One is the period of the Gaonim, and the other is the period of the Balei HaTosfos. So it's not always clear, whether Rabbi so-and-so belongs to the Gaonim or belongs to the Balei HaTosfos. And Reb Nisan Gon sort of is one of those, and maybe somebody could be kind enough to look up exactly when he died. But I think he's in that middle of the road period. And here we have to underline the next 3 words. He says, if you ask me which is more chum, let's say a person doesn't fulfill an essay. Okay, we'll give him makas martas. Another person violates a lotas. And if it's a classic simple lotas, he'll get malchus for that. Not makas martas, get makas no rice. And if it's a more severe lotas, he might get posiliators, he might be chayv kares visa. I mean, a lot of them are very severe. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the Balatanya, what they call the Admura Zaken, the Alter Rebbe, asks this question in a different form. I have to do my research on that, but I think he says, unbelievable mashal, says that if a king commands you to do something and you don't do it, that's an act of rebellion. But if the king tells you not to do something and you do it, that's more than rebellion. He gives a mashal. It's like taking someone's head and putting it into a toilet bowl. I mean, he gets very, very specific about it. So certainly a violation of a law when the king tells you not to do something and you do the opposite. The king calls you, he summons you in, and he says, be there at 9 o'clock tomorrow, so you don't show up until the day after. That's pretty bad. You might get hung up from a tree for that. I don't know. But it's not as bad as doing an act of rebellion of a lotas. Comes along Rabbi Nisan Gon and he says, Vachuvahi, Shatora Amrlo Silva Shatnes. Vosifa Tnai Amr Gedilim Tasel Lomar. Shekol Ikar Isa Levishas Kalayim Lo Nemar El Shalom Mokomitzis Sitzis, Alo Mokomitzis Sitzis, Lo Nichnas Klal As Harazu, Vechol. So on both sides, we finally came face to face, encountering one Rishon who takes the position of Putra with regard to esidokalosis. And this is very difficult. I mean, the Balei HaTosfos, Ramban, and others will not accept this. But you understand from where he's coming. How could it be that an essay which is relatively kal vis-a-vis a lotus that can override a lotus? But the answer is that the Torah never prohibited you in a situation of an essay. That's called huj. Now we get to the Marik. The Marik is much later than the Bali Atosis. The Marik, I believe, is in the 1600s. And his last name was, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, was Cologne, something like that, Kalon, or I think it's spelled with a C. The Kosav Shalomachra can be watched on Essay Dochalosas. He means that the language is Dechia. We're not operating with a limitation in the law and a hutra. The old hikcha, Shalafize ein lavdil bein lotas agredel bein lotas sheshbo kares. If the Torah is saying that b'makom mitzvah you're not prohibited, then that should apply even if the lotas is more chamor. Kevin she'ena tchia ba machmas kocha essay. In other words, it's not the essay that's now overriding the law, but rather milchatchila, the original law, as it was given as an ashara, it was mandated only shalom b'makom mitzvah, not b'makom essay. The Ayov Shmu already, that's already much later. Right, that's what we said. The difference between Yibum and Esed Dochalosa is Yibum means that the Torah did not prohibit you in the Erev of Eishes Ach, and that's called Mitzvah Savaka. But otherwise, it's Esed Dochal. So if I would summarize the two paragraphs that we have, the first paragraph gives us an explanation, and the second paragraph tells us that that explanation is untenable. We cannot accept it. We're not going to operate with this kind of a hutra business in order to understand and explain Essay Dochalosis. Essay Dochalosis said certainly clearly is a dechil. And now we get to Ava in Europe. Let me ask you a question on both sides. Which is greater, Ava or Europe? What? What do you mean? Right? Is it the highest level to reach Avas Hashem? I mean, Yiras Hashem, in a sense, if I do this, you're going to punish me. I'm in a classroom. Steve was a classroom teacher, right? So I'm afraid to do something because he has good eyesight, and I'll get punished. He'll send me to the principal. Well, make me stand in the corner. I don't know what. You never did that. I hope. No, you I'll get sued for child abuse anyway. So that's Europe. The truth is that there are two levels of Europe. There's Yiras HaOnech and Yiras HaRomans. I mean, the Rambam at the beginning of Yisodei HaTorah speaks about a higher level of Europe. I guess in English you'd call it not fear, but awe. I could have Europe, my parents, not because I'm a young child and I'm afraid my mother will spank me and my father will dock me from my allowance. There's a higher level of awe of my parents. I have awe of my parents. Right? Unbelievable. The Chai Adam says that Yiras Aviv V'Imo means that you should believe that your parents are unique in the face of the earth. There's no one like them. That's not always so simple. So that's kind of awe that you have. But I would still say that Ava is a higher level. I mean, the Rambam compares Ava to Avas Ish V'Ish. He says that Shir Hashirim is all a metaphor for the highest level, the most intense love. The Avaso Yishket Tomid, meaning if a person's lovesick, they can't think about anything. And that's the level of Ava that we have to aspire to. And here we're going to distinguish between a lotus and an essay, and then weigh the two on a scale. A lotus is the bechin of Europe, and I'm afraid to violate the will of God. On the other hand, an essay means that's how I express my ava for Hashem. I want Hashem to be proud of me because I fulfill His will. So says the Ramban, mitzvahs haseh yotzeis mividas ha'ava. Ha'osem mitzvahs adonov. If I'm not mistaken, it's in Parshas Bo. Oh yeah. Oh, he says this is the Ramban on the Aser Sadibros when he speaks about Zohar v'Shomer v'Diburecha, the two dimensions of Shabbos observance. There's the positive dimension, which is called Zohar, and the negative, which is called Shomer. Anyway, he says, Ha'osa mitzvah sadonov ohuvulo. I fulfill the will of my master because I love my master. Ilu mitzvahs lo taseh, yotzes mibidas heyira, ki nizah milasos masherah b'eino adonov, Yarehu also is afraid of being punished by his master. Lachain, says the Ramban, Esei docha lo taseh, ki ha'ava chashuva yoser mi hayira. Al af shaver alav chamur yoser ki heder hayira gorua mi heder av. The Ramban himself, in a certain sense, realizes how problematic his position is, because to violate a law is that much more severe than non-fulfillment of an essay. Or, if I would have negative points and positive points, so that a violation of a law would be minus 100, and the fulfillment of an essay would be plus 50. Now you have a head-on collision between an essay and a losa. Obviously, which are you going to choose? Are you with me? What would you rather have, a minus 100 or a plus 50? Which is more severe? No, I thought that was clear. Minus 100 is a lot worse than plus 50. No, you don't. Is that not intuitive? So the Ramban is aware of the fact that, wait a second, it's much more chor to violate the law. You're going to say, well, for the sake of the essay, I'm going to violate the law. What do you mean? You're going to violate the will of God? That's much more severe than fulfilling an essay. Again, fulfilling an essay gives you points, but what are you sacrificing on the other side of the agenda? You're violating the will of God. The Ramban is aware of the problematic nature, but he says, Afal Piche. I still insist that I'm right, that the mitzvah of Ava in an essay overrides the mitzvah of Yira, right? It trumps the mitzvah of Yira in the case of a losas. But how does that work? I mean, I understand that Ava overrides Yira. Well, let's say, for example, I had a choice. I don't know. I can't think of a reality, but let's say I'm walking on a thing, and I down a road, and I can either go to the right or the left. I have two roads, and one is for the mitzvah of Yira, and one is for the mitzvah of Ava. So obviously, if I have that choice, I'm going to opt for the mitzvah of Ava. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a case in which he violates the losas, which means he's liable for an avera chamura, much more chamur than the essay, because even if you classify an observance of a losas as yira, which is a low level than observance of an essay, which is ava, but we're talking about a situation where he's violating the losas, which is clearly more chamur, the Ramban admits that, than the mitzvah aseh. So I don't know. Amarsha kasav shahoil v'kiyum ha'essay hu al yidei ma'isa al kain hu chashiv yoser v'kiyum lav she'eno ela b'shei v'altas. Again, very problematic. Now it's true. I mean, nobody could deny the Marsha that an essay requires a ma'isa, whereas a losasa requires of us shevi altas and being passive, but that's not what we're talking about here. The violation is just the opposite. He's violating it in this case. We're talking not about a case where he's avoiding a losasa. We're talking about a case where he's violating a losasa, which is clearly a kuvase. He's putting on a megachel kilayim. The same objection that we have with regard to the Ramban, we have with regard to the Marsha. Rashi ala Torah mevi mechilta shema shenever b'chol asher amarti aleichem tishmoru bol elamed shebechol mitzvah seyesh gam losas shekein b'chol makom shenemar loshen hishomer yesh bo lav. Because of a sifsei chachamim, sheme'acher shebechol esei yesh gam lav, is alkein esei dochalosis. So let's just summarize. I asked you the following question. Are we talking about philosophy here and pure speculation, or are we operating within the halachic universe? And we have 4 answers. I said there were 5, but I made a mistake. There's 4. So let's see if we can vote on this and we can come to a unanimous decision. How to classify these 4 answers. So we'll call A is philosophy and B is halacha. Start with Reb Nisan Gaon. Is it A, which is philosophy, or B, halacha? B, absolutely. Then we go to the Ramban. Is the Ramban operating within A, philosophy, or B, halacha? A, it's philosophy. The Marsha, that we're differentiating between a kumvase and a shebi altase. Is that halacha or philosophy? I don't know. Can't figure it out. The Marsha eludes me because the very logic of the Marsha is contradictory. I mean, he's telling me that we're talking about a shebi altas. We're not talking about a shebi altas. I don't know where to class. I think the Marsha is trying to convince us of something halachic, but I don't see it. Rashi is halachic, but the funny thing is, Rashi is taking a mechilta literally. And the mechilta is saying that every essay entails a losas, because if you don't fulfill the essay, you violate a losas. I mean, that's not true. That undermines everything we know. So Rashi is making a halachic stab based on a non-halachic text. The mechilta can't be taken literally within a halachic text. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop for today. I'm having a lot of fun. I hope you are too. Okay.